The sharp, metallic hiss of air brakes broke the quiet morning air, but it wasn't a visitor Clara was expecting. Standing on the worn porch of her late father's farm, her coffee mug frozen halfway to her mouth, she watched in disbelief as a massive commercial dump truck slowly backed up her gravel driveway. The air quickly filled with a thick, sour, fermenting stench, a heavy smell that instantly hit the back of her throat. Before she could even step down off the porch, the heavy tailgate swung open, and with a deafening roar, 20 tons of steaming dark mush tumbled onto her fertile soil. It was spent brewery grain, sludge, wet waste, and rot, dumped right in front of her barn like a hill of trash. Her neighbors quickly gathered by the fence, whispering, shaking their heads, and calling her out of her mind. To the whole town, Clara was just a grieving widow, letting her family's legacy turn into a stinking, ruined junkyard. They said she'd lost her mind, and by nightfall, the local county inspector was already pulling up her drive with a fine in hand. But as Clara stood in the damp mud, watching the steam rise off that putrid pile in the cool air, she didn't see ruin. She saw something everyone else was completely blind to. Block 2. The county inspector didn't even bother stepping out of his truck right away. He sat behind the wheel with the engine idling, looking through the glass at the massive, steaming heap sitting right where Clara's father used to park his John Deere tractor. When he finally stepped down, his boots crunched heavy on the gravel. He tipped his hat, but his face was hard. He handed Clara a bright orange violation notice, a fine for unpermitted industrial dumping that threatened to wipe out what little savings she had left. "Clara," he said, shaking his head with a heavy sigh. "Your dad worked this land for 40 years. He kept it pristine. If your husband was still here, he'd never let a commercial brewery turn this farm into a town dump. You've got 48 hours to clear this off, or the county is stepping in." Clara stood her ground, her jaw set, clutching her coffee mug so tight her knuckles turned white. The smell was overpowering, a thick, sour mash of wet barley and yeast fermenting in the morning heat. From the road, a couple of pickup trucks slowed down. Old friends of her father's peered through their open windows, talking among themselves, shaking their heads in pity. To them, Clara was a woman drowning in grief, making desperate, irrational decisions after losing both her father and her husband in the span of 2 years. They remembered her as the bright girl who used to sell sweet corn from a wooden wagon at the end of the lane, back when life was simpler and a neighbor's word meant everything. Now they just saw a widow ruining her own inheritance. What none of them understood was the sheer mountain of debt Clara had been quietly facing inside that empty farmhouse. The hospital bills, the back taxes, the cost of keeping 40 acres afloat on a single income. It had all piled up until the bank was ready to stick a foreclosure sign right next to the mailbox. When the local craft brewery down in town called her earlier that week, practically begging for a place to dump their leftover grain after their usual hauler backed out, they offered her a couple $100 just to take it off their hands. To the brewery, it was useless waste. To the town, it was an eyesore. But Clara remembered something her grandfather used to say while leaning on his pitchfork after a long day in the fields. "Nothing the earth grows is ever truly wasted, child. You just have to know how to give it back." As soon as the inspector's truck kicked up dust down the driveway, Clara didn't panic. Instead, she walked out to the old wooden barn, pulled out a heavy steel rake, and went straight to work. Her plan wasn't just to let the grain sit there, it was to mix it. She spent the entire afternoon hauling dry oak leaves, wood shavings from the local lumberyard, and rich straw from the back loft. She began layering the wet, nitrogen-rich brewery grain with the dry carbon materials, building massive, structured windrows that stretched across the yard. Her hands blistered inside her leather gloves, her shoulders burned, and the sweat dripped off her nose into the dirt. Every couple of hours, she used the old farm loader to turn the piles, letting oxygen deep into the heart of the heap. By midnight, the physical exhaustion was catching up to her, but as she thrust a long steel soil thermometer deep into the center of the largest pile, the needle began to jump. 110 degrees, 130 degrees, 150 degrees Fahrenheit. The heat was rising inside the pile. Millions of unseen beneficial microbes were waking up, breaking down the sour grain and transforming the pungent sludge into something else entirely. The foul, sour smell of fermentation was beginning to fade, replaced by the deep, rich, sweet scent of warm, living earth. The next afternoon, the inspector returned, ready to issue the final citation and call the heavy equipment to scrape her land clean. But when he walked up to the pile, he stopped dead in his tracks. The stench was completely gone. In its place was a gentle rise of clean steam coming off a dark, velvety material that looked like pure black gold. Clara reached her gloved hand deep into the center of the pile, pulled out a fistful of the rich, steaming compost and held it out to him. "Smell it," she said quietly. The inspector hesitated, then leaned in. He expected the rot of old beer. Instead, he smelled the clean, crisp forest air after a fresh spring rain. He looked down at the dark, crumbly texture, then up at Clara's tired but triumphant eyes. He slowly folded the citation, slid it back into his breast pocket, and shook his head in quiet disbelief. Word spread through the small town like wildfire. The crazy widow hadn't dumped trash. She had manufactured high-grade, nutrient-dense organic compost in less than 48 hours, using a process nobody in the county had ever seen before. If stories like this one, stories about quiet grit, holding the line when everyone doubts you and honoring the land, remind you of the hard-working folks you grew up around, take a second to hit that subscribe button. It really helps us keep these classic American stories alive. Within a week, local gardeners were pulling up to Clara's gate with 5-gallon buckets and pickup beds, eager to buy a scoop of the magic soil that was making town tomatoes grow twice their size. Clara was selling out faster than she could turn the piles, but just as she thought she had finally found her way out of the dark, an unexpected envelope arrived in the mail. It wasn't from the county, and it wasn't a bill. It was an official legal notice from a massive agricultural corporation operating 2 towns over, and they were claiming that her new composting process violated their patented commercial methods. Clara sat at her father's old oak dining table, staring at the bold, threatening letterhead on the legal document. An industrial agribusiness giant with deep pockets and a team of high-powered lawyers was claiming her specialized recipe for breaking down brewery grain violated a broad chemical patent they held. They demanded she cease operations immediately or face a lawsuit that would bankrupt her within a month. For 2 days, the farm was silent again. Clara walked out to the long, dark windrows of composting grain, running her hands through the warm, rich soil. Everything in her told her to yield, to sell off the equipment, and to let the bank take the land. It was the sensible thing to do. But then she looked toward the old barn, where her father's hand-carved wooden sign still hung above the double doors. "Do what is right, and let the chips fall where they may." Instead of backing down, Clara did something that took the whole town by surprise. She loaded up 5 heavy burlap sacks of her handcrafted soil into the back of her father's rusted 1978 Ford F-150. She drove straight down to the State University's Agricultural Extension Office, 2 counties over. She didn't ask for a lawyer, she asked for a scientist. A senior soil biologist agreed to test her compost under the microscope, purely out of curiosity. What he found made him call over 3 of his top colleagues. Clara's unique blend of spent craft brewery grain, hardwood shavings, and natural aeration hadn't just created good dirt, it had cultivated a unique, highly concentrated strain of mycorrhizal fungi. It was a completely natural biological reaction that neutralized harmful plant pathogens while boosting soil water retention by nearly 40%. It wasn't a chemical formula like the corporation used, it was a pure, natural biological process born right out of traditional American farm wisdom. The university immediately published a brief on her method, granting her a public domain agricultural certificate. that rendered the corporate patent claim completely useless. The legal threat vanished almost overnight, but the real explosion was just beginning. Word of the university's findings reached the regional farming network. Commercial organic orchards, vineyard owners, and family farms across 3 states didn't just want a bucket, they wanted tons of it. The same brewery that had paid her a couple $100 to haul away 20 tons of grain signed a long-term contract, paying her every single week to process all of their organic waste. Within months, 3 other regional breweries joined the program, desperate to turn their disposal fees into a sustainable local partnership. Clara bought 2 old commercial turners, hired 3 local young men who needed good-paying work, and transformed the back 20 acres of her property into a thriving, eco-friendly soil enterprise. By the end of her 2nd year, her small, homegrown operation cleared over $400,000 in gross revenue, completely wiping out every last cent of her family's debt, saving the homestead, and securing her family's legacy for generations to come. Before we finish this story, if you are the kind of person who still values the grit of the old ways, honest work, and seeing good folks overcome the odds, go ahead and subscribe to the channel. It lets us know you want to see more stories just like this one. Today, if you drive past that old dirt road, you won't see a junkyard or a neglected property. You'll see green fields, a bustling local business, and an old red barn standing tall against the blue sky. Clara didn't just save her farm with a pile of waste that nobody else wanted. She proved that with a little faith, a lot of hard work, and the wisdom passed down from those who came before us, even the heaviest burdens can be turned into life's greatest blessings.